On April 1st, 1990, an Arizona highway patrolman walked up to an 18-wheeler. It was just, parked on the shoulder of Interstate 10.
Yeah, right in the middle of the night.
Exactly. And he thought he was doing like a routine welfare check on a tired driver. But instead, he basically ripped the lid off a 15-year cross-country mobile torture chamber.
A chamber that the entire United States justice system didn't even know existed.
Right. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are extracting the most crucial insights from a massive stack of forensic and historical sources, custom-tailored directly for you.
We really want to understand a terrifying systemic failure in an edition of the show we call control studies.
And if you're familiar with control studies, you know we analyze the architecture of how real serial killers actually got caught. We look at the specific granular failures that ended their systems.
And critically, what a smarter, more disciplined approach would have actually looked like.
Yeah, we don't do sensationalism here. We do clinical, analytical postmortems.
So our subject today is the truck stop killer. He was a long-haul trucker who operated with a really terrifying level of discipline from approximately 1975 to 1990.
A full 15 years.
Yeah, a decade and a half.
Yeah.
And the mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct how he built this geographically dispersed machine that successfully evaded detection for all that time.
We're going to look at the structural advantages he engineered, right?
Yeah.
And more importantly, why that very structure eventually just collapsed under its own weight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that brings us to the core paradox of his capture. I mean, he wasn't taken down by forensic evidence.
Right. No DNA match or anything.
No. Or a pattern detection algorithm, or like a brilliant detective connecting dots on a corkboard. The system he built was dismantled by a single, completely uncontrolled variable.
A flashing hazard light.
Yep. And the only reason that hazard light mattered was because his deep psychological requirement for prolonged captivity fatally conflicted with his own rules for survival.
It's fascinating, but to really understand the infrastructure of these crimes, we have to start with the psychological blueprint, don't we?
We do. We need to look at what made this specific complex system an absolute necessity for him. So we have to look at his origin.
Right. His birth in 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa.
Yeah, and the foundational event of his adolescence. His early life was heavily influenced by his father, who actually served in West Germany.
Leaving him to be raised primarily by his mother.
Right. But the pivotal marker really hits when he's a teenager, because his father was arrested for the sexual molestation of a 12-year-old girl.
Which is just, an incredible shock to the system for a kid.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And before any trial could even take place, his father committed suicide.
Forensic profiles from our sources consistently highlight this sequence as the architectural blueprint for everything he would later do.
Yeah, you have to look at the mechanics of what the father modeled here. It's a severe transgression, right? Followed by extreme public shame.
And then it concludes with total permanent abandonment just to escape the consequence.
Exactly. The father essentially established a template. It was all about asserting absolute illicit power over a vulnerable target and then erasing himself from the equation.
So the system couldn't hold him accountable. He essentially watches the ultimate authority figure in his life assert dominance in the most destructive way possible.
And then just vanish.
But I kind of want to push back on the idea that this trauma forged like an inevitable destiny. Because when you look at his school records right after his father's suicide, they are incredibly normal.
Surprisingly normal.
He played football. He was on the wrestling team. He sang in the school choir and joined the French club.
Right.
So if he had these dark impulses planted by his father's actions, why didn't they manifest aggressively in his youth? Where are the glaring red flags of, extreme deviance?
Well, it challenges our common misunderstanding of how psychological incubation actually works. I mean, we tend to expect a traumatized adolescent to act out in highly visible ways.
Like getting into massive trouble, destroying property, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Violently disruptive behavior. But for someone whose core drive is shifting toward absolute control, blending in is actually itself a form of control.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Normalcy is the camouflage. But, if you look closer, the cracks were actually there.
Right, the petty stuff.
Yeah. The record shows he had multiple arrests for theft and physical altercations during his teenage years.
It's like he was stress testing the boundaries of authority. He was committing these smaller, petty transgressions to see how the system would react.
Pushing against the fence to see if it was electrified.
Exactly, long before he fully understood the kind of extreme dominance he actually craved.
And that boundary testing takes a definitive turn after he graduates in 1964. He enlists in the United States Marine Corps.
But that military stint ends in a dishonorable discharge,
Yeah.
right? Following his involvement in a robbery.
Right. And honestly, the specific details of that robbery are a lot less important than the bureaucratic consequence of it.
Because it stays on his record.
Exactly. That dishonorable discharge permanently disqualified him from his next objective. He wanted a career in law enforcement.
He actually applied to become a police officer, and he was flatly rejected, specifically because of that military discharge record.
And that rejection is structurally vital to this entire analysis.
Yeah.
Because he actively sought a position of authorized, institutionalized control over others.
He wanted the badge, he wanted the uniform.
He wanted the legal backing of the state to assert dominance, but the system evaluated him and denied him that authority.
So because he couldn't obtain sanctioned power, he didn't just abandon the desire.
No, not at all. He decided he had to build a sovereign domain entirely outside the system, a place where his authority could never, ever be challenged.
And you see this pivot toward domestic control almost immediately after that. I mean, he drops out of college, works various warehouse jobs, and just cycles through 3 marriages.
His third marriage, to a woman named Deborah, marks a truly terrifying escalation.
Because during the 1980s, he becomes deeply involved in the BDSM community.
Right. And documented accounts in our sources show that he systematically subjected Deborah to severe verbal, physical, and sexual abuse.
He moves from external, almost generic criminal behavior, like the robbery in the Marines, to highly specific, intimate physical dominance.
He is basically constructing the environment of control that the police department denied him. He's utilizing his own home as the staging ground.
So he has the psychological blueprint of transgression and disappearance from his father. He has the systemic rejection from law enforcement.
Yep.
And he has the practice of physical dominance from his domestic life. He's identified exactly what he requires, unchallenged authority over a contained space.
But the problem with a house is that it's fundamentally static.
Right, it doesn't move.
It has neighbors.
Yeah.
It has property lines. It has a fixed address. A domestic partner has family, colleagues, and social ties that act as tripwires.
So to truly operate without consequence, to achieve that permanent evasion his father modeled, he needed to take that contained space of absolute control and detach it from the grid entirely.
Exactly. He needed a profession that offered unchallenged authority, mobility across jurisdictions, and the appearance of purposeful, legitimate activity.
And he found the perfect cover. Because the system denied him institutional authority, he sought out a profession that allowed him to physically build his own sovereign domain on wheels.
He became a long-haul truck driver.
And for you listening, it is crucial to understand that this occupation was not incidental. It wasn't just like a paycheck to him.
No, it was the fundamental architecture of his evasion. The 1970s and 80s trucking industry provided the ultimate operational shield.
It gave him a legitimate reason to be in any state at any given time.
Right. It provided a professional identity that explained erratic movement, odd hours, and hundreds of thousands of miles logged across the entire country.
More importantly, it gave him the physical truck itself. Let's get into the physical layout here, because the truck as a sovereign domain is terrifying.
It really is. He heavily modified the sleeper compartment of his semi-truck.
He installed ceiling-mounted handcuffs and heavy-duty restraint systems right into the cab.
Yeah. And he actually built a hidden storage compartment, specifically designed to conceal chains and purpose-built torture implements.
Which means these modifications required deliberate, planned installation. They were structurally integrated into the vehicle.
Meaning the intent from the very beginning was sustained captivity, not just a quick, opportunistic crime.
The truck became a self-contained environment. I mean, he didn't need a remote cabin in the woods or a soundproofed basement.
The location of the crime was the vehicle itself, moving at 65 miles an hour down the interstate.
But I have to ask about the logistics here. Cause converting a commercial vehicle into a mobile dungeon seems like an insane risk.
You think so, yeah?
Like, what about weigh stations? What about Department of Transportation inspections?
It's a good question.
It's like running a counterfeit money press out of a bank vault. You're using the system's own architecture, the Interstate Commerce Network, to hide an illicit operation in plain sight. Surely the system has checks and balances.
Well, the legal and functional reality of a sleeper cab is exactly what makes this so difficult to police.
How so?
Legally, the sleeper cab is considered a private domicile.
Wait, really? Like a house?
Basically, yeah. While a commercial vehicle is subject to weight checks on the axles, logbook audits, and, external safety inspections at weigh stations.
Right, the stuff they do on the highway.
Exactly. The interior of the sleeper cab is not subject to routine, warrantless interior cargo searches by standard inspectors.
He essentially wrapped Fourth Amendment protections around his crimes.
He weaponized those protections. It gave him mobility, a professional alibi, and a completely private domain with no fixed address.
He could move continuously, changing jurisdictions daily, leaving absolutely no geographic footprint that any single local law enforcement agency could track.
But the infrastructure is only one part of it. Perfect infrastructure needs the right inputs to remain undetected.
Right, he didn't grab people from suburban driveways in broad daylight.
No. He utilized a victim selection logic we're going to call the report probability filter.
He strictly targeted hitchhikers, runaways, sex workers, and stranded motorists.
And this selection process was cold, calculated, and purely structural. These specific demographics share one vital property.
An incredibly low report probability.
Exactly. If you abduct someone with deep, immediate ties to a community, alarms sound within hours.
The police are mobilized, the media is alerted, and a definitive timeline is established.
But a hitchhiker who disappears is already in motion. Their presence at any specific mile marker on any specific highway was unplanned.
Right, undocumented and frequently unknown to anyone in their life.
And if a runaway vanishes, the family and the system have already classified them as voluntarily missing.
And if a sex worker disappears, the report might be delayed, or it might be made to an agency that historically marginalized those specific investigations.
In every single category he targeted, he maximized the gap between the abduction and the report. He was banking on the fact that a report might never come at all.
And there is a harrowing piece of the source material that proves just how deeply he understood the systemic blindness.
Yeah, this part is really tough.
During his active years, an 18-year-old victim actually survived. She escaped from the truck, made contact with law enforcement, and told the police exactly what had happened to her.
But the operation did not end there.
No, it didn't. She didn't press charges, and her stated reason for withdrawing is just devastating.
It really highlights the entire flaw in the system.
She believed that no one in the justice system would take a young hitchhiker seriously over a licensed, employed professional truck driver.
She thought her word would never hold up in court against his.
Objectively speaking, this was not a failure of his system. It was a calculated exploitation of societal bias.
The circumstances that led that young woman to doubt she would be believed were the exact same features his selection logic relied upon.
He weaponized the credibility gap. He knew the system fundamentally favored the employed, licensed professional over the transient youth.
And her decision to withdraw allowed him to continue without a single legal interruption.
His evasion wasn't just physical movement then, it was psychological warfare against the justice system itself. He knew the system's blind spots better than the police did.
Which brings us to the ultimate blind spot of the era.
Jurisdictional fragmentation.
Right. To understand how he remained invisible for 15 years, we have to really look at the investigative landscape of the 1980s.
Because this was a pre-digital law enforcement environment. Paint a picture of that for us.
Well, think about today.
Today, if a car is linked to a crime in Florida and gets pulled over in Oregon, an automated license plate reader pings instantly.
Right. But back then, information moved at the speed of paper and phone calls.
Wow.
There was no national database instantaneously cross-referencing missing persons reports with suspect vehicle movement.
There was no automated system linking truck driver logbooks to unidentified bodies found across state lines.
Exactly. Law enforcement communicated via teletype machines, carbon copies, physical bulletins pinned to cork boards, and individual phone calls between detectives.
So if a body was found in a rural county in Texas, it was investigated solely by that local sheriff's department.
And if a body was found in a rural county in Utah, it was investigated by Utah authorities.
They were two entirely separate cases housed in metal filing cabinets 1,000 miles apart.
And his physical mobility fed perfectly into this fragmentation. Let's walk through the timeline of the married couple case because it illustrates this geographic evasion perfectly.
From November 1989 to January 1990, a husband and wife are hitchhiking from Seattle, Washington,
Heading to a religious convention in Georgia.
That is a massive distance. And they accept a ride from him near El Paso, Texas.
Now, the dynamics of this abduction reveal his rigid protocols. Almost immediately after the pickup, the husband is executed.
Because the male victim always represented a physical threat,
That's right.
and a logistical complication to his psychological program.
Exactly. The threat was neutralized quickly, and the husband's body was dumped on the side of Interstate 10 West in Sutton County, Texas, in January 1990.
So he leaves the neutralized threat in Texas jurisdiction, but the wife is kept alive.
She is held captive in the sleeper compartment, raped, and tortured over an extended period of time as he continues his trucking route.
Eventually, she is murdered, and her skeletal remains are discovered by deer hunters much later, in October of 1990.
And she is found in an isolated mountainous area near Interstate 15 on the Utah-Nevada border.
Trace the map of that single crime. The abduction occurs in one jurisdiction. The first body is deposited in a second jurisdiction.
The captivity spans multiple state lines over weeks.
And the second body is deposited in a third, highly remote jurisdiction. It's baffling to think a cross-country crime spree of this magnitude wouldn't trigger a massive federal alarm.
It really is.
It's like someone executing a massive corporate data breach, stealing millions of files, but instead of selling them on the dark web, they print out single pages.
Right.
And they leave one page in different local public libraries across 50 states. No single librarian knows a massive heist has occurred. They just see one random piece of paper.
That's a perfect analogy. An academic case study actually analyzed this specific killer under the title Murder One Jurisdiction at a Time.
Wow, that says it all.
It does. The study concluded that because his crimes spanned so many different state and county lines, no single agency ever had enough data points to recognize a pattern.
Because from any individual sheriff's perspective, they just had a tragic, isolated discovery along a highway corridor.
Exactly. Because he had no home territory and traveled constantly shifting routes, there was never a concentration of disappearances in one area that would warrant a full-scale, multi-agency task force.
He was a ghost in the machinery of local policing. The system he built was nearly flawless for evasion.
He has the mobile infrastructure, the report probability filter, and he is masterfully exploiting the technological limitations of the 1980s.
But here's the core tension of this deep dive. The very system that was so perfect at hiding him housed a fatal, inherent contradiction.
Right. The very thing that drove him to kill inherently compromised the safety of his operation.
The methodology protected him from the outside world, but it could not protect him from his own internal requirements.
Let's look at the case of the 14-year-old boy and girl in February of 1990 to see this tension rip the system apart.
He picks them up while they are hitchhiking in Texas, and just like the married couple, he reiterates his protocol for threats.
The 14-year-old boy is quickly eliminated. His remains are eventually recovered in Mississippi.
Geographic dispersal again?
Yes, but the treatment of the female victim is where the operational security completely breaks down in service to his psychological needs.
The 14-year-old girl was kept alive, not for hours, for weeks.
Weeks in the cab of a semi-truck.
And we know this because of the photographic evidence that was eventually recovered from his home.
These weren't just snapshots. They were a meticulous sequence of images showing progressive bruising on her body.
Her hair was cut at varying lengths in different photos, documenting her sustained suffering over a long period.
He was documenting his absolute control. And the culmination of this captivity is perhaps the most chilling detail in the source material.
He drove her to an abandoned farmhouse in Illinois.
He forced her to cut her hair again, dressed her in a black dress and high heels that he had specifically brought for this purpose.
And staged a final photograph of her in that barn, her arms raised in terror, before he finally killed her.
Her body was found near that Illinois farmhouse months later.
Let's look at this from a purely clinical evasion standpoint. Keeping a kidnapping victim alive in a commercial truck for weeks, driving across state lines, stopping for fuel, risking way stations. I mean, that is the highest possible liability.
From a security perspective, it is completely absurd.
Why not eliminate the risk immediately? Why risk the entire 15-year evasion architecture just to take a staged photo in a barn?
Because you have to define sadism in functional terms here.
Right.
For him, the killing was merely an endpoint. It was the cleanup phase.
Right.
The prolonged control, the sustained terror, the physical marking, and the documentation. That was the psychological program.
The photos functioned exactly like trophies.
They weren't incidental souvenirs. They were a required preservation of the control he had enacted. Without the prolonged captivity and the documentation, The act didn't fulfill his psychological requirement.
It's funny, this fatal friction between maintaining perfect security and satisfying a psychological urge is so textbook that it actually inspired the killer's profile in the thriller novel Adam.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the guy in that book literally studies real historical cases like this one to fix their mistakes, which you can find on Amazon Kindle. But looking back at the real-world collapse of this case, it's fascinating how rigid that internal requirement was. He couldn't just turn it off to save himself.
He really couldn't. The system was built to facilitate the sadism, but the sadism demanded an exposure window that the system couldn't endlessly protect.
He had to keep them alive to fulfill the urge, and keeping them alive was the one thing that could destroy him.
The methodology had run for 15 years. It survived way stations. It survived a victim escaping. It survived the entire pre-digital law enforcement apparatus.
But that inherent tension between needing a live victim and needing to stay hidden finally intersected with a completely random routine variable on a dark highway.
On April 1st, 1990,
Walk us through what happens.
Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller is on routine patrol on Interstate 10. It's the early hours of the morning.
And he spots a semi-truck parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights on.
Now, a truck parked on the shoulder with hazard lights blinking is not an anomalous event.
No, it happens thousands of times a night across the country. Drivers pull over to check mechanical issues, to look at a map, or simply because they are fighting fatigue and need a quick rest.
So Trooper Miller is conducting a standard welfare check. He is just stopping to see if a motorist needs assistance.
The irony here is staggering, because the killer did the responsible trucker thing.
Exactly. Putting on your hazards when pulled over is a basic safety discipline meant to deflect suspicion.
It signals, I am adhering to protocols. But instead of deflecting suspicion, it invited a routine check.
It's like building an impenetrable multi-million-dollar fortress with biometric locks and then accidentally leaving the front door propped open with a shoe while you go check the mail.
After 15 years of outsmarting multi-state jurisdictions, he wasn't caught by a brilliant FBI profiler.
He wasn't caught by a massive task force connecting the Texas and Utah murders.
He was caught by a flashing hazard light.
So Trooper Miller approaches the cab of the truck, and what he discovers immediately shatters the 15-year illusion.
He finds a nude woman inside the sleeper cab, handcuffed and screaming.
The killer attempted to talk his way out of it, which actually fits his behavioral profile perfectly.
Right, he was a man used to managing smaller complications with a composed demeanor and a plausible account.
His professional status as a trucker had always afforded him the benefit of the doubt.
But no plausible narrative can explain away a visibly distressed, handcuffed, living victim in plain view of a highway patrolman.
The reality of the situation was absolute. He handed over a handgun he was carrying, and Trooper Miller arrested him right there on the spot.
For aggravated assault, sexual assault, and unlawful imprisonment.
And when they finally searched that truck, the hidden compartment, the chains, the ceiling restraints, it all came to light.
The search of his home produced the photographs, the visual record of the married couple, and the young girl.
Let's break down the specific failure point here, because it validates everything we've discussed.
The physical architecture of his operation was sound. It protected him from external detection brilliantly.
But it could not protect him from his own internal requirement.
Think about the alternative scenario. If the victim in his cab that night had been dead and disposed of hours earlier, what happens when Trooper Miller pulls up?
Trooper Miller asks if he's having engine trouble. The killer says, no, just checking my tires.
The trooper says, have a safe night, and drives away, no arrest.
The system failed because the live victim was the one variable his architecture could not contain.
He needed the extended captivity. The exposure window was unavoidable if he was going to satisfy the psychological drive.
The hidden compartments are opened. The photographs are found. What follows is the final accounting of his crimes.
And it really exposes the limits of the justice system in resolving the full scope of an operation this vast.
The legal accounting took decades to solidify.
In 1994, he was convicted in Illinois for the murder of the 14-year-old girl found near the farmhouse.
He initially received a death sentence for that crime.
However, Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011, and his sentence was automatically commuted to natural life imprisonment.
And it wasn't until 2012, more than 2 decades after the crimes, that he finally pleaded guilty to the murders of the married couple.
Receiving additional life sentences. He is currently serving his life sentence in Illinois.
But the confirmed convictions are only a fraction of the reality.
The source material indicates there are 50-plus suspected victims connected to his route network between 1975 and 1990.
50-plus disappearances and killings. And yet, he has never been charged for them.
Why? Because the very jurisdictional fragmentation that protected him while he was active is still protecting him now?
Right. Without bodies, and with the fragmented records of local agencies from the 70s and 80s, definitive case linkage is almost impossible to establish in a court of law today.
The ghost in the machine left very few traces that can be prosecuted.
The justice system simply cannot catch up to the scale of what he accomplished in the blind spots of that specific era.
Let me pose a final theoretical question to you. Based on the physical infrastructure he built, the truck, the geographic dispersal, the report probability filter, if he had been capable of altering his psychology,
Right.
like if he didn't need the prolonged captivity, the photos, the sadism, if he could have just abducted, killed immediately, and disposed of the victims, would this system have ever been caught?
Structurally, no.
Really?
The pre-digital law enforcement system had absolutely no defense against his design. If he had minimized his exposure window to zero by eliminating victims immediately, there is no systemic mechanism from 1975 to 1990 that would have aggregated those isolated roadside discoveries into a single cohesive profile.
He would have retired entirely undetected.
The failure was not investigative. It was entirely structural to his own psyche.
That brings us to the core thematic lesson of this deep dive. A system, no matter how rigorous, can close every single gap that discipline can close.
It can exploit jurisdictions, it can leverage social biases, it can turn a commercial vehicle into an invisible fortress.
But it can never close the gap created by the psychological compulsion that makes a killer operate in the first place. You cannot engineer your way out of your own pathology.
The system serves the urge, and eventually the urge consumes the system.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to mull over. We've spent this time analyzing how this specific architecture thrived in the pre-digital 1980s.
Right.
But consider how this exact same mobile structure would fare in today's landscape. If someone attempted to run this operation tomorrow, how long would they last?
With GPS fleet tracking mandates on commercial trucks, cell tower pings tracing the movement of every phone in a cab, and automated license plate readers on every highway overpass.
Could a purely mobile architecture still exploit those jurisdictional boundaries? Or has technology effectively closed the report probability filter for good?
It's a terrifying question. We like to think the blind spots are gone, but every new system creates its own new shadows.
And as a final reminder, if you are fascinated by these concepts of operational failure and perfect discipline, you can see them explored in a fictional setting in the novel titled Adam, available on Amazon Kindle. Thank you for joining us for this clinical breakdown. We will see you next time.